So, Natasha De Teran, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk a bit today about payments, this thing that impacts all of our lives, but this thing that we perhaps don't pay that much attention to. And so whilst we're going to get a little bit into the weeds today, before we do, I want to ask you a question which is perhaps a bit overly simplistic, but one which I think is important, right? Because asking people like me to define what a payment is like asking a fish to define what water is. It's all around us. We don't think about it. It's just this part of our lives. So perhaps we can start here. What actually is a payment?
A payment is a means of transferring value from A to B. And we do that because we're settling debts. So I want to buy something from you, and therefore, if I took that thing, I would incur a debt to you, and I need to settle that. So a payment, breaking it down is two or three different things. One, it's a societal convention. So in our case, do the two of us accept the same means of payment? But I suppose, so that means the same way of transferring value. But I suppose before that, we need to agree on a common asset that we're going to accept. So we're both living in Wales, as it happens, and we both use sterling. So we're both agreed that we'll pay and receive by sterling. And we then have to agree whether it's going to be a bank transfer, whether it's going to be in cash, and so on and so forth. Again, we both live in the UK. So we will have several different means, in fact, probably, depending on what you use, to settle that debt. We could meet up and hand over notes. We could make bank transfers. We might have payment apps. We might have wallets. So it's those two things, if you like. It's the instrument, it's the two things. One is the need, because no one pays unless they need to. Secondly, it's the asset, and thirdly, it's the convention. And a convention has now grown into a system or multiple, which is itself composed of multiple systems. So the UK has a payment system in capitals, if you will, which is the system that allows my pound to move from my bank to your pound at your bank. But along the way, there are many systems behind that enable that process to happen.
And so where did this contemporary idea of payments come from? I imagine one day back in the past, somebody would trade a sheep for I don't know, insert thing here. But at some point we switched to, like you say, to these common currencies, these common accepted payment methods. Where is the furthest point in history where we see something that resembles kind of like what we have today?
Well, I think there's lots of argument about when exactly it was. But the idea of the sheep being exchanged for the vegetables, let's say, you have to have the double coincidence of once, which is substantially imperfect, because we're both in Wales, and there's lots of sheep and vegetables, and probably a need for some other bits of kit. So you need to have an efficient way to transfer value, firstly within a compact society, and then within a less compact society. And when I'm compact, I mean distanced or proximate. But there's evidence of all sorts of things being used, whether it's seashells, whether it's stone tallies, and all sorts of things, which are sometimes work more as measures, if you like, than the sort of transactional tools that we have today. A modern society couldn't have happened without the progress that there has been in payments. And looking back into, in the medieval ages, if you ask the question, would contactless payments be useful? It would have been a ridiculous question to ask, because it would have been so distant from them. So when you think about future payments, some of the work that's been done in the payments industry to develop new tools, sometimes you sit there and you think, well, what's the need? And sometimes the industry comes up with innovations that then create business opportunities and business techniques and so forth. So it's a very fascinating world.
Do you remember the last payment you made?
Well, I can remember the last interesting payment I made. I was on a train in Italy last week, getting to the airport, and the machines didn't work, and the ticket office only took cash. So I had to get on the train without a ticket, which they said was fine. And then the ticket master came round, and we were in a tunnel most of the way to the airport, and she was unable to take payment from any of my cards. And we went through a lot of my cards. But then 10 minutes later, having arrived at the airport, and sort of got onto Wi-Fi, I then got 3 payments accepted on my cards, on my various cards, because I'd used 3 different ones. So that was that shows some of the problems that you can have with payments.
So this is an interesting segue because between your money going into your bank, sitting in your bank, and then eventually making it through 3 times, it seems, to this Italian railway company's bank, lots goes on, right? For you, generally, other than in this example where it sounds like an absolute faff, it would be a few seconds of your life that you do quite passively and habitually. And yet, as you hinted at in your first answer, there's a vast amount of infrastructure and systems that goes on to make that payment possible. So in the case of that payment that you made in Italy last week, what actually happened? How did the money get from your bank to theirs?
Well, it might not have got there yet. I don't know whether it will have actually hit their bank. And that's one of the interesting things that we don't think about as consumers. If there's people with shops on this call or that run businesses, listening to this podcast, they're probably acutely aware of the time it takes for money to arrive actually in their bank, to materialise in their bank account. And also they will be very aware of the delta between what you pay and what they receive. And it's unless it's a note, it's not a pound for a pound. Your question, how many people are involved, that very much depends what instrument I've used. If I've used my debit card, there's less people involved than if I've used my credit card, depending actually. I might have used a digital wallet, and I might have sucked money out of my account into my digital wallet, and then my digital wallet might run on Visa or MasterCard's rails, and they might have an intermediary between themselves and the credit card networks, so that there can be many people sitting along that chain, which is why when you pay a pound, the shopkeeper doesn't get a pound. They get 97 pence or 95 pence or 99.9 pence, depending on who they are and what sort of rates they need to pay in order to receive money.
And so the subtitle of the book is, I think, the most interesting piece here, which is the subtitle is "Changing the Way We Pay Changes Everything." And to me, particularly as somebody who hadn't really considered this stuff until I picked up your book, this is interesting because the effects of us habitually as individuals changing our individual payment habits and methods, even just in my lifetime, is shifting so dramatically under our noses. And perhaps one of the most obvious moves of this recently was our step in the direction of being a slightly more cashless society. There was a lot of talk in the pandemic about the perceived dangers of our society moving towards being cash free, and although what was being prophesized perhaps didn't quite come to fruition, it's definitely true, at least anecdotally in my experience, that far fewer places now accept cash. What are the implications, or at least the potential implications, when we reach that point of society being cashless?
Well, I think we've already reached the point of needing to protect cash. You may be aware there's lots of efforts underway in the UK to define and put in place processes and rules for cash distribution, so ATMs or post offices giving out cash, or shops giving cash back, to hardwire the access to cash for the future. But access is no use unless there's acceptance, and that's something that I think a lot of work will be done over a prolonged period of time to work out the finer points of that. I think you have to take a step back, or we have to take a step back. And you said something interesting just before the call, that payments have become quite inseparable from us, and you meant that in another context. But payments are inseparable from the way that, they're integral to the way that we live. So to participate in society, we need to be able to pay and be paid. We might be paid very little, and we might have very little to pay with, but we need to be able to do those things. So we need to be able to access some form of money. Cash is obviously one of those. We need to be able to store it somehow, which in cash's instance is not ideal. It's in a wallet or under a mattress, or in a bank. And we need to be able to give it over to someone and exchange it for, quite literally bread and water, but hopefully a bit more than that. So one of the things that we as a society and all of society have to consider is if we move to digital and some people don't come with us to digital or don't come with us to digital money, and those are two separate things, and don't or can't, those are things. How are we going to ensure that they still have a means of paying and being paid? And it is a society-wide problem. It's not something that's on the fringes, because frankly, if you can't access money in any shape or form, then you steal or starve. And I don't think, well, none of us should want that. So we all have to think about that. And some of the changes that would be necessary to enable a cashless society, well, obviously you would have to have full digital inclusion and enablement. You'd need to have offline capabilities, unless we were to get to a situation where online was freely accessible and available to everybody, everywhere. And we'd also need to make sure that there was societally wide confidence and satisfaction with the data and privacy questions around non-cash payments. And I think where we see the holdouts on cash, there are those that are simply not comfortable with it because they're not attuned to digital, and they feel safer handling cash for personal, not because of some fear of being spied on or otherwise. It's simply because that's how they like to operate. There's those that can't, because they simply can't handle anything other than cash. There's those that don't have the money to find it cheaper to use cash, and we can argue about whether it is cheaper ever to use cash. And then there's a big group of people who are simply unhappy with the privacy aspects of the non-cash existence, which is another issue. And so there's a lot to resolve before you could go to a completely cashless society, and the United Kingdom is a long way from that. I think what's in and around these discussions, it's a bit depressing, because you do have the sort of the far ends of the discussion making the most noise. Those that want the world to go fully digital and say that everything's solvable, and on the other hand, you have those that are complete conspiracy theorist holdouts that won't see progress. And personally, I'm not sure that in my lifetime we'll see the disappearance of cash, but I'm here to be proved wrong.
So ignoring those on both ends of the fringes and discussing those challenges that you just spoke of, within, say, your lifetime, what do you think the easiest of those challenges or those obstacles is to overcome? And what do you think is going to be the absolute last frontier, that hurdle that we just really struggle to ever get over before we are fully cashless?
Gosh. Well, I'd like to think that digital enablement and access will be a very emphasised piece of work that governments and society works on, because it's the digital or the analog premium. And there's often a talk about other premiums, but the analog premium is huge. And if you can't buy tickets digitally, if you can't search for price discovery digitally, all these things are really, really problematic, not to mention, education and access to information and so forth. So I would like to think that the digital one would be the one that's solved, and fast. But then you still come down to data. And one thing I didn't touch on was cost and control. So in the world of credit cards and debit cards, depending on who you are as a merchant, you'll pay more or less for accepting card payments. And those costs will relate to the scale of your activity, because obviously, the more that you do, the more you're able to negotiate optimal costs. And the second one is the activity that you're engaged in. So I think if Sean, you were going to steal my credit card, you might go to an Apple store, but you probably wouldn't run off to Tesco. But I prefer it if you didn't go to Tesco. But the likely incidents of abuse in a supermarket are probably lower than they are, in a gambling den, maybe in online pornography, or even in an electronic store. That might be where you'd head with my stolen credit card. So those sort of organisations pay more, and that's a risk based, some mostly a risk based decision, which can be justified based on the amount of theft, fraud, and so forth. But there can also be moral decisions or ethical decisions that some of the companies can take. Maybe you're not allowed to make a payment to Wikipedia, which happened with the card networks, WikiLeaks. Or maybe you're not allowed to make payments to sex workers, or maybe you're not allowed to make payments to certain news outlets. And when you have very powerful payments companies, your democratic choices that you are able to make in a free democratic society are sort of taken away from you by organisations. And in some aspects, if it's a search engine, well, it's not the end of the world. But actually, if it's a means of payment, that starts to be problematic if there's no alternatives. So I think there's a host of other things that need to be ironed out, and it's particularly important in payments because it's a scale industry. Really is a scale business. So the biggest will always tend towards monopoly, and therefore that you can end up with one or two or sometimes three companies deciding. And that's not a situation that I think we all want to be in. Even if we might agree with some of their moral principles, it's another thing to say that their moral principles should eradicate your democratic liberties.
Do you see a near future where there are perhaps more payment processing companies? I looked at my friend Christian Owens, who's building paddle.com, and they are building this end-to-end. They're valued as something vast now, like $1.6 billion. They started a few years ago because they are taking on the monopoly that is Apple being able to process all of its payments inside of its ecosystem. And there are these antitrust cases going on right now, which may topple that monopoly. And therefore, we can arrive at the conclusion that consumer choice will be good in that particular niche. As more and more and more of us rely on these very few systems, do you think that there is room for competition, or will it just be the case that these big players will continue to grow exponentially and that's that?
There has been the emergence of a lot of competition in recent years in different areas of payments, and very little in others. And then there's been a lot of concentration. I think at the moment we will see a lot of, given the financial, the economic conditions, the lower availability of VC funding and so forth, and probably some of the stretched business assumptions that some of the incomers came up with. I think we'll see less in the near future. I think the competition authorities, we see them all over the world looking at different parts of the payments world. So I think they will be very energetic in payments, and they will need to continue to be so, because what's big, what's small today can suddenly become very, very big in a very short space of time. And in China, the two payments giants, which are steadily being sort of dismantled, if you will, by the Chinese government, they rose from zero to hero within 10, 15 years. They were basically running the country's economy, and that's a big country. So I think there needs to be enough competition and enough choice for us to be able to exert that we have some alternatives, we have some redundancy, but I don't think it's an industry that can usefully support an awful lot of competition at all the levels.
So if we go back to this point of the societal impacts of moving or just changing the way we pay generally, right? I look at high street banks closing. I'm from a small town in Northamptonshire called Corby. And when I was, 15 years younger, there were banks everywhere. Like every third shop on the high street was a bank. There's probably 3 banks in the high street now, with a population of about 70,000 people, and that number will no doubt shrink further. I look at ATMs disappearing. We spoke just before we started recording about my mum as an example. She is predominantly cash based. She has a bank card. She relies on ATMs. Her options currently are a paid for ATM in a corner shop near her house, which never works, or like a mile walk to go to another ATM, which sometimes works. And if it wasn't through the proxy of using me or my brother, who have access to the internet and things like Amazon, like her world would be very small, right? She would be able to transact with very few businesses, and she would be able to venture not very far in doing so. I read a stat, I forget whether it was in your book or whilst I was researching this, that 4% of UK adults do not have a bank account. And so that is 2.1 million people as of today right now who do not even have access to a bank account, let alone digital literacy. For those, to use your phrase, who either can't or won't get on board with digital, what are the wider societal dangers of millions of people being left behind?
Oh, gosh, there's lots stacked up in that question. Just one thing on the bank account. I mean, I think anyone that can identify themselves can get a basic bank account. Whether they know that's another matter. And I think it is complicated now that banks are not physically there on the high street. You wouldn't be able to go in and find out that you could get a basic bank account. But you don't actually need a bank account to participate economically in the digital world, or even in the card world. There are, apps and other things. I think when you don't have any form of ID or accepted ID, and that can also sometimes include an address, a utility statement, all these, and those could cause huge problems from immigrants, those that are recently released from prison, those that haven't had any form of anything, any kind of account when they reach the age of 18 and leave home. So there are things that need to be done there, so that the typical bank account opening process doesn't apply to digital wallet providers and so forth. But I think the digital wallet is a fantastic concept. I think one of the problems that one of the issues I see with some of the digital wallets is, quite recently, some of them have been developed to target precisely the recently released from prison and the immigrants and those that haven't had bank accounts for what they perceive to be cost reasons. But in fact, actually, when you load money onto a card, when you pay money off some of those cards, you're charged. So while you and I might actually have free banking in our no bells and whistles current accounts at HSBC or Barclays, people that are poorer than us might be paying more to use their pounds in card form. So I think that is problematic, and we need to. I think the concept of the basic bank account, I think, is fantastic, and the obligation on high street banks to provide them is wonderful, and very, very important. But I think we need to see the equivalent in a digital form. Then to the question of getting those people digital that weren't before, that aren't happy to, like your mother or my father. And my father does many things digitally. I'm not sure about your mother. He's happy to FaceTime. He uses Excel. He uses Word. He does FaceTime. He's used a computer for the last 20 years of his career, having started when personal computers didn't even exist. And he's very uncomfortable with online banking. The banks, like many others, when they developed, and I think many of the fintechs, they're not typically thinking about the older generation when they're designing their interfaces, their apps, and so forth. And the industry's always look to get a customer young and keep them for a long time. So if you look at a lot of the marketing, and if you go to a bank's website and see how they present themselves, it's very much at the younger customer. It's not at the older customer. And when digital banking first came along, a lot of them didn't use it. A lot of them, many of the older generation started using it during lockdown, those that hadn't before. But that isn't really a way to bring a service to your customer. The way to, it's not a gun to your head is not the ideal way. And so I would hope that some of them would rethink the way that they have expected their customers to continue being their customers in a very different way than before. And I don't think enough attention has gone to that. There is a fantastic initiative called One Banks, I think it's called, or One Hubs, which aims to actually go further than that. So aware that bank branches are closing, and the ongoing need for face-to-face banking, they create these kiosks or hubs or so forth in towns, which can be occupied, if you like, virtually occupied by multiple banks, but which have faces and people to speak to, and are a sort of middle way of enabling people like your mother and my father to get into digital banking, gain confidence, and to see what they can do with it, as opposed to just being sent an email or a letter in the post saying from now on you'll only get your statements online, or you have to pay £5 to get them by post, which isn't really the way you should treat customers. Even if one can understand why the banks have done this from an efficiency point of view, from a possibility point of view, one can fully understand why they've done it. But I think they have missed a trick in ignoring the older customer. And I think if a single bank went out there to service that older customer base, which is a very important customer base for many reasons, but one of the key reasons is they have the money. So if you want to be able to lend out money as a bank, you need to have money. And if you don't have the older customers' money, then you aren't lending to younger customers.
I smile because I literally got one of those "we're going paperless" letters yesterday. I spoke a few weeks back on here to Rory Sutherland, behavioural scientist, and he claims that short of a pandemic, which, like you say, is essentially a gun to the head when it comes to behaviour change, the two ways that we as consumers, as humans, change our behaviour is through either habit or social copying. So either we will continue to do what we have always done, or we will copy what other people do when in doubt. For this untapped older generation who perhaps aren't yet confident with digital, are there any ways that you've seen of how a bank, or banks plural, are enabling them to either get into the habit of being digital or showing case studies of other people being digital? Because I didn't clock until you said it. You're completely right. Bank marketing is 22-year-olds carrying boxes looking happy with their new home. It's not Fred, the 71-year-old.
No. No, I mean, I think they've been, as I said, they've been incredibly lazy. They've been very, very lucky to have people like me and you to help our parents deal with digital banking. And I think during the pandemic, vast swathes of the population were helping other swathes of the population deal with that, and other aspects of technology, I imagine, as well. So apart from one banks, I haven't. I think in Spain, where there's so Spain has been the UK is skewed old, but Spain is skewed old a bit more, and they've been much more attuned there, it seems to me, of all the problems that this presents, not just banking, but in all sorts of ways. Travel, the way that all sorts of parts of general life are skewed young, and the impact that has, whether it's actually just the working age or employment habits. There's a tendency to want to employ young, and actually, if we're living to 90, we need to work longer. And so, what do people do when they're reaching retirement age, or not even reaching retirement age, but employers just want young people. So there's been a lot more thinking there, a lot more public sector, private sector collaboration. And there's some very interesting fintechs coming out of Spain looking at it, how they can target the older generation. And one particular one, which I don't think it's gone live yet, that's a card. It's basically a loyalty card. And you can use it, I think, if you're over 55, which in Spain is defined as the older generation, rather worryingly for me as I near it. So you, as an older generation person, have one of these loyalty cards, but it's your children or grandchildren that enjoy the benefits. And this is sort of, it's a wealth transfer mechanism. And there is and has been a lot of intergenerational wealth transfer in Spain. They had a very bad crisis in post 2012, very prolonged, and a very high incidence of unemployment. And it was very much the older generation that was supporting the younger generation. So this sort of builds off that, and it's a very clever concept. But the idea is that with something very tangible, very easy to think about, you're attracted and very easy to use with no risk, as it were, because it's not involving you in more economic risk than you would have been not using the card, that it will attract some of the less digitally confident people into digital use.
When you say that it benefits the younger generation, is it a concept whereby somebody in the older generation spends and say their grandkids are getting cash back, or is it, how does that work?
Yes. So if your mother or grandmother buys a Saga holiday, you'd get Saga cash back. I presume you would not need to spend the money with Saga. So I think within the unit, those the organisations that subscribe to the card, you'd be able to use your money there. So you might want to spend it more in Mothercare or down at the pub. Um, so so yes, that's basically how it works. You get the points, and the points are money or prizes.
That's really interesting. So returning back to the UK for a second, there is this British stereotype. We were talking about this before we started recording, and I'm glad that you recognised the kind of tongue-in-cheek statement that it seems like everybody says when we're at the checkout in Tesco and we're paying by contactless. And it feels almost illegal to not say the words, "Oh, this is dangerous." It feels like I'm not spending real money as we transact in that way. Between contactless and things like Apple Pay, is there any truth in that? Are we spending more blindly now that there is less friction between even the few seconds we say between putting a PIN number in and being contactless?
Well, I know that I am, and I do have to correct myself and actually remember to look at the machine and what the number says, as opposed to just trust that it's what it is. I think the danger really is that we overspend. And that's a very real danger when you had to fumble in your pocket for change and found the bottom of the wallet was empty. It was, or that you took out your allowance for the month from the bank in cash and steadily chomped your way through it. Or as you saw yourself nearing the end, you started to, stop spending in the pub and save it for the milk you needed the next morning. You don't have that visibility or that tangible kind of proximity to the bottom of your wallet with digital. But that said, the apps and also depending on the settings that you choose to have, can give you a very, very vivid picture of what you've spent and how you spent it. They can, I think mine are set up to trigger an alert every time I use them. And so what I actually tend to do now is rather than look at the machine, I just look at my phone and check that the sum is more or less what I expected to have spent, or exactly what I expected to spend. But that's a change in habit, isn't it? From taking a receipt, checking it, counting your pennies. And it sort of brings us to who are payments designed for? Payments are designed, well, obviously they're designed for both sides, for both you and the merchant. But the merchant is the first order customer of the payment provider, not you. And the merchant has to be convinced to change system and to pay for that system and every time it takes payments. And what does the merchant want to do? It wants to sell as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and get the money as quickly as possible. So clearly, contactless is much better for them than cards, because you don't need a person necessarily. Contactless cards, you don't necessarily need a person. It can be very fast, and it can encourage spending. Depending on how much cash that merchant was taking, it was probably, they might have had someone overlooking the teller to make sure the teller wasn't stealing money. There would have been security, there would have been transport for the bank, there would have been lodging costs at the bank, there would have been lost, if they held on to the cash over the night, there'd have been security risk, there'd have been lost interest, all sorts of things that make cash unideal in many aspects for merchants. And contactless, kind of really exciting, because many of us don't think when we're spending, and it can lead us to overspending. But that's, contactless is probably going to be quite last year, quite soon when we think about it. And you talked about Amazon Go before we got on this call. And are we going to use fingerprints or eyes in the future to make payments? So we'll need to come round to understanding money in a different way, I think, in controlling costs in a different way to that counting your shekels. Although many people precisely choose not to use cards or use cards but not contactless, precisely because of this danger of overspending and just not being in control, that lack of control.
I have It's a very basic system, but I've created a little system with myself recently for that exact reason, which is that I would say, if I had to guess, probably 95% of my payments are done through Apple Pay now. And although, like you say, the number pops up on my screen afterwards, there's very little reason for me to log into my bank and keep track of things. So I've opened a Monzo account. I had to think there. That's how unbrand loyal I am to this particular account. I opened a Monzo account a few months ago, and I take a set amount of money from my current account each month. I put it in there, and that's like the money I can spend frivolously. And that's not to say that I don't overspend every now and then and transfer more money through. But it's just staggering the difference between what I spend in. For example, 2 months ago, I didn't bother doing it at the beginning of the month. I didn't make the transfer. And so I didn't bother doing it until for the whole month. I'm quite absolutist. I thought, you know what? I've gone 3 days without doing my transfer. I'll just leave it for the month. The amount I spend when I'm not tracking that, when I don't have a yardstick that physically shows, you're this far into your monthly spending budget and we have 19 days left. When I don't have that, it is genuinely, this sounds like an exaggeration, I'll probably spend double if I'm not keeping track of it. When it's coming from this, say, endless pool of money, but you know what I mean? When it's coming from this harder to measure, more opaque pool of money, because I don't know what budget is what, I absolutely fly through it. And so to your point, it's really interesting, these technologies, Amazon One Click, which I refuse to use just because it's buggy right now. It sends things to wrong addresses and so on. But then Amazon Fresh, going into store, picking things up. Are there prices? I don't remember if there are prices, but you walk out and then you get an email. To build on your point, are we about to be pushed even further? Just as we're getting used to contactless, just as people like me are building these little systems in our lives to keep track of our money, is technology about to push us further?
I'm sure technology will push us further all the time. I don't think that's in any doubt. And there's so much investment and innovation around the area, and that's good. It's good, but I'm really fascinated by your comment on Monzo, because I also have Monzo and I've got Revolut, and so does my father. You, like us, are using it as a wallet in much the same way that in the old money days, Sean, we would have a wallet and we'd have our £20, £50, £20 and £10 and £5 notes and £1 notes. I'm even old enough to remember those. And you would go through them and you would be aware of how much spending you had, and maybe you went to the bank twice a month, depending on who you were. But what you carried around in your wallet was what you were going to spend. You didn't carry around more than that, and maybe you took it out in a month. As I said, you decided the periodicity with which you withdrew the money, but it was money that was going to be spent. That was the purpose of having it. And I think the idea of the digital wallet and using accounts like Monzo or Revolut as digital wallets, even though that's not what they necessarily want us to use them for, they'd rather use them as current accounts and mortgage providers and so forth. I think it's a really, really, really compelling and undersold case for them. And I think it's the idea that you have your full month's salary spendable, immediately from your current account at a wave is not something you want. But I'm interested that you also don't find the idea of being able to empty your current account on a wave as a compelling attraction. Because a lot of when you look at a lot of the marketing around payments, including to consumers, not just to merchants, it's all about frictionless. Now, my mother and your mother and my father are not probably very keen on frictionless, because they've got a fair amount of money and they want to hold and a limited runway to earn any more, probably, and they're very attuned to the fact that they really, the idea of money leaving their account isn't a great idea. So that brings me back to the marketing. This idea that paying away money very quickly is fantastic. Well, it is when you're taking the tube. It is when you're getting on the bus, buying a newspaper, buying a coffee. That's fine, but it is limited to those small purchases, really, that waiving is most compelling.
So I'm going to ask you to make a big I won't ask you to make a generalization, but my question is leaning massively towards the realm of generalizations here. I'll caveat it with that. But as we move into this direction of less friction, of things like Klarna, where it's like pretend money that you pay back one day in some point in the future, contactless, all of this stuff, are consumers really winning here? This illusion we're being sold that this is good for us as a general measure of society, is this actually good for us? Or are we seeing things like debt per household tick up in line with these quote unquote innovations?
I don't know whether net debt, household debt has grown, and how much of that you can attribute it to the likes of Klarna. Consumer credit is, it's widely available. There hasn't been a huge amount of competition in consumer credit in the last, I don't know. In fact, there's probably been a contraction, if anything. And so the emergence of a new form of consumer lending, if you think consumer should borrow, must be a good thing. And we can talk about whether consumers should borrow to buy makeup or dresses or electronics they don't need. We could also argue about so I think that's a separate problem, and it's a very real problem, and it's a particular problem in the Anglo-speaking countries. We all borrow an awful lot on consumer credit. And that's not the way to run an economy sustainably over time, as many people are finding now with rates going up. It's tricky, and I think Klarna is finding it problematic with rates going up as well. But you have the intersection of very many things with Klarna. You have a low level of financial literacy, and you have digital marketing, and you have digital marketing of Klarna alongside digital marketing of frocks and makeup, and you have very fast consumer behaviour going on. So you've got a confluence, quite a toxic confluence of things. And to take one, to hold Klarna to account for, an 18-year-old girl spending too much and not understanding what she was doing, I think it's tricky to lay it all at that industry's door. I think the regulation needs to catch up, and it needs to catch up fast. I think the most important thing is that we improve financial literacy. And I think the more that we move away from cash to other forms of money, the more important that is. And when you were paid £100 at the end of the month, you had nothing left. You kind of understood where you were. You knew that you were going to get another £100 next month, and if you needed to buy a fridge on the Never Never, so in order to make your food last longer, that was a calculation you had to make. But now we're so divorced, or you can be so divorced from all of that, and I think that you could be buying a loan on a credit on your phone, and the amount of information you're going to absorb from your phone is just simply because of the size and the merit of the size of the screen and the rapidity with which you can do things can mean you can get into very dangerous situations very quickly. On the other hand, competition is good, innovation is good, but yeah, literacy. I can't underscore how important one, financial literacy is, and two, on the other hand, is the digital inclusion and digital access, because you can get on and find a Monzo bank account and discover it's grateful and compare it and go compare in all these places and Money Supermarket. If you're not online, you can't do that. So you will have far less choice, far less information on which to make your choice, and chances are you'll be paying quite a considerable premium for uploading cash onto your card or spending it off your card.
So I've just started reading, I forget what it's called, Why Can't We Print More Money, or Can't We Just Print More Money, that book project from the Bank of England. And that's really interesting on this point of the importance of financial literacy, because again, until I picked up your book, until I picked up that book, until I started delving ever so slightly into this world, I didn't realize the gap that exists between people who, it's almost like the curse of knowledge, right? We find it hard to appreciate the world through the paradigm of somebody who doesn't know what we know. And I see just from the intro, the foreword to that book, that the Bank of England is doing an awful lot. They have an awful lot of initiatives, outreach panels, community groups, a book. They've published a book for the public to explain economics.
Very good one.
I am enjoying it so far. How much do you think society needs to catch up? Of course, we've spoken a lot today about how these technologies, these payment platforms, these systems are flying ahead. Can we, 60, 70 million people, catch up?
Well, you've got to hope that we can. We need to, and it's vastly unfair if we don't. So we have to. I think the the way that we teach about money needs to be changed. I think everything that the Bank of England is doing is fantastic, really fun. I don't know if you've seen their Beano stuff and so on and so forth. But the Bank of England doesn't get to where it doesn't get beyond its interested audience, and it's the uninterested audience. It's the people sitting at the back of the classroom that need to be listening. And probably the more problems that you have with money at home, the less money that you have at home, the worse relationship you will have with it, and the less interested you will be in money. But I've seen, and so you need to make it very tangible and very relevant to them, but also to the non-economists, people like me, who frankly I'm an artist. So you need to make me interested. I'm not interested in a mortgage. I might be interested in how to buy a house, but let's think about that. How many young people today are thinking that they can buy a house? So why, in the 1970s and the 1960s, 50s, 40s, it might have been a really legitimate way to explain money. It really isn't today. And even if it was a sensible way, the way to start the conversation wouldn't have been, we're going to learn about mortgages today. Because someone that's interested in money per se is interested in how mortgages work, but somebody who's not interested in money doesn't want to know how insurance works or mortgages work, or they want to know how money works. And personally, I think it starts with paying. But again, when I was looking at some recent educational material, I also saw that it started with notes and coins. And I thought, well, that's helpful up to a point, but seeing as many of these children won't be touching notes and coins ever, and my daughter's 14, and she can't deal with notes and coins at all. And as soon as she's given them or earns them, I get given them to put onto, to bank into her account. So I think we need to rethink education, financial education, and I think we need to make sure that the program is put together by people who are completely and utterly uninterested in money, and that aren't economists, and that don't have a natural facility or interest in money, because money shouldn't be interested and understood only by those that have a natural interest. It needs to be understood by absolutely everyone. And I think that's the biggest challenge, developing that syllabus.
I spoke at a school recently, and it was during a PSHE breakaway week. I think it was just before the summer holidays, and the students kind of do all these different things to learn about adulthood before they go out into the big wide world. And my friend there, Marcel, who organised the week, who definitely isn't an economist, devised this little half-day exercise, and it sounds silly to say it amazed me, but it amazed me because it was A, so simple, but B, so different to anything that even 10 years ago I learned in school, which was essentially that he pulled, I believe, I'm paraphrasing here, he pulled the average salary that those students would be earning in a job if they left school, tomorrow, in that area, and then he took things like the average rental value of a property in that area, and all of the things that you need to pay, right? Council tax, utility bills, and then had each of these students create a budget to show that there are decisions, right? Do you save this money, or do you get, I don't know, Netflix and Spotify? Do you buy this thing? Do you not? And even that, as silly as it sounds, as basic as it sounds to somebody like you or I, is just vastly different to what we learned in school about money, which was, the only thing I remember is like the history of coins back with the Vikings. Like, how is that useful? What is that?
Yeah. I know. I think it is interesting, but it does presuppose that you're genuinely interested in the subject yourself. Whereas you need to buy and get the buy-in at the back of the class, and the back of the class, and also the most economically, financially disadvantaged, those people that might come to the class with a hate relationship with money because they just see it as a barrier, which it will be in their lives. But money is also this incredibly positive enabler, and I think education needs to turn that round so that, again, those uninterested actually see it for what it is, which is an enabling thing, not necessarily having lots of it, but it allows me to buy something from you. It allows us to exist together without, stealing and shooting and so forth.
how much of this is mindset? I didn't plan to ask this, but just thinking about the point that you just made there. So I come from a background where we had basically no money growing up, right? There's a period in my late teens, early 20s where I have a picture on my iCloud of when there's a very particular reason for this. Like this isn't illustrative of my whole childhood, but there's a picture on my iCloud where my fridge is empty, right? I don't mean like a few things in there, I mean empty. And fortunately, at a different time, there's a picture where my freezer is empty. And so I now run a business. You know, we're transacting with fairly big clients. We're having to make big payments. We're having to invest. We're having to speculate. And the biggest challenge that I have so far faced, both in business, but also in adult life, if I can call it that yet, is overcoming this kind of discomfort with money, overcoming this willingness to pay for things, because I always saw money as this incredibly scarce resource, and if you get it, you hold on to it and you don't spend it, and to spend money is irresponsible. And I guess I could have gone down a very different path if I didn't have a business partner who was more comfortable with investing in things or spending money. You know, that would have held me back in life in many ways. How do we, from a more fundamental mindset level, help people feel more comfortable with payments in the younger generations? So we've spoken about why older generations are uncomfortable. What about those who are just getting to grips with their relationship with money?
Well, I mean, a balanced relationship is a good one, isn't it? And you found it in your business partner, and that's probably a good mix, because your frugality is nothing to be worried about, I don't think. I mean, I think as an entrepreneur, you need to be able to take some risks. So you found the partner that will help you take that journey, and you're probably a useful break on his enthusiasm, or hers. And that's what we all in our own, you know, personal economies need to create. But I think this barrier question, this so money, clearly a lack of money is a barrier. That there's no question. And the cost of money, so if you need to borrow money, that's also a barrier. And in consumer credit, I think the easy access of consumer credit is slightly problematic there, because we can take it out very, very quickly, particularly with the buy now, pay laters, without necessarily having credit checks and all of that sort of thing. And so that we can access borrowing sort of too fast for the wrong things, and yet for small businesses, it's very difficult to borrow money, and that's the wrong way round. We need small businesses to borrow money to grow. But I think seeing money as purely a negative is very problematic, and I think when we haven't touched on cryptocurrencies, but let's just think about money in the context of cryptocurrencies, and why particularly I think sterling, euros, and so forth are enablers, and alternative currencies are disablers. So in the UK, we can move sterling, £1 from Barclays in Wales to £1 in RBS in the Outer Hebrides, and it gets there immediately for free, my pound to their pound. Fantastic. And as a result of that, I can buy whatever I can buy in the Outer Hebrides for £1 and get it sent to me, and people there can work and engage in commerce in the United Kingdom. That is amazing. It is absolutely amazing when you think about it. And remember that wasn't possible. It wasn't possible for that to happen in the instant 15 years ago. In my childhood, that wasn't a possibility. You know, I can't remember the dates, but you know, things used to move much more slowly. There was much more fragmentation. When checks first arrived, you could only cash them at the same bank. Then you could only cash them in the same county. Then we set up a national clearing system, and within a week a check could be cashed if it was signed in the right way. So the way that the combination of the asset sterling and the payment system in all its glory, which includes the banks and the fintechs and so forth, have enabled us to transfer value instantly within the United Kingdom is fantastic. There's no risk, there's no costs, and it's fast. That enables the UK to function as it does. Now, if you introduce another asset into the equation, or a completely distinct payment system with a differently funded kind of asset, or a differently backed and protected sort of asset, you risk creating two economies within the same economy, and that's which would be far worse than, or on a far grander scale, let's say, to the cash to digital question. It would complicate pricing. It would introduce exchange risks. It would expose consumers to in the case that these were private cryptocurrencies, which obviously they are at present, to the insolvency of the providers, also, the time difference from one to the other, to investment risks they don't understand, to all sorts of frictions that just wouldn't be beneficial. Now, can crypto in other ways introduce benefits? Quite possibly. I don't discount it. Can digital currencies, if properly backed and regulated and fungible and interchangeable with the pound in much the same way that your Barclays money is interchangeable with my RBS money, that's fantastic. And maybe it will allow us to process much smaller volumes than we can today, and to pay for fragments of things. So I think some of the innovations could be good, but the fragmentation of money itself into different forms of money, with different backing and so forth, that takes away the public goods, the enabling aspects that money, fiat, sovereign backed money has. And I think if we can, without all of that sort of I think if we can explain the societal benefits at the most basic level and what we need money for, and it's not for buying a house or buying a car, it is to exchange value at the basic level and to enable us to economically interact with each other. And it's very important. It's hugely important.
So on this piece about cryptocurrency, I know you pulled me off on the phrase halfway through this conversation when I used the phrase old money. My point is, with your background, to somebody who is a big cryptocurrency investor, would be considered old money, right? In a very literal sense, it is in their view the old version of money. But as somebody who has vast amounts of insight and experience and probably know more about payments than almost everybody who has ever transacted in Bitcoin or invested in Bitcoin, do you think Bitcoin or cryptocurrency as a project even has merit? Like, what once the kind of, I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Luke Burgess, the author of a book about mimetic desire, this idea that we desire what other people desire, and that pushes up the price of things like Bitcoin. When this wave of excitement has gone, are we ever going to see Bitcoin as a payment method, as a currency, or is this just a fad?
Well, I think it's very faddy. I don't think that. I think that technological experimentation has to be a good thing. I think, does it have some bad side effects? It can do, but if we weren't prepared for that, we wouldn't progress. I think all the hype and the rent seeking and the profiteering that's going on is very sad. I think there will be some good folk out there. There's a lot of bad ones, that's for sure. There's a lot of nonsense being spouted out there. But let's come back to currency and what its point is. The point of a currency is to enable value to move within your society, in our case, the United Kingdom. And we trust the bank and the government and the laws and the judicial system and all sorts of other things to make all that stand up. And it does. It works pretty damn well. You could argue that it's one of the best sort of financial systems, or a payment system, certainly. Although each payment system is developed for its own economy, and society, so it's a good boast, but it has its limits. Why would something else be better than that? Now, one of the touted benefits of crypto is that you can use it to exchange value across borders better than going through currency exchanges and so forth. Well, when you want to exchange pounds for euros, say I'm in Europe and you're in the UK, one of us buys and the other one sells, and But if we did that through Bitcoin, then both of us have to sell our sterling and our euros and buy Bitcoin. So we're introducing more cost into the equation, or we're taking on Bitcoin risk, and we're just sitting on a pool of Bitcoin to fund our activities outside. So we're taking on a new risk when actually your risk is sterling, your mortgage is sterling, your company debt is in sterling, your Sainsbury's bill is in sterling. So you're incurring another risk, which is, as a speculator, you might want to do that. But for your day-to-day kind of current account, wallet type of stuff, I don't think you do want to. And the idea that we can supplant our economic societies with something out there that's better, I think is kind of fanciful. As we know, nations don't agree on an awful lot of things. And it's not just our governments that don't agree. As civilians, we don't necessarily agree with behaviours in other places. So you'd be giving up everything that enables you to participate, and all your trust banks in the UK, which you might have arguments with many times, but at least you can have those arguments with the system here. But you can't if it's out there, and if it's out there, who's designing it, and what makes them better than what you have at home. And then the final point is, what about those that can't participate in this new currency? Those that aren't digitally enabled. So you could get back to this kind of splintered system, where some of the United Kingdom, the wealthier in the United Kingdom, are using one currency, but if you're only buying a third-hand car, then you're using good old pound sterling. I just don't see the benefit. I don't see the upside at all, and I do see a lot of dangers with it, I have to say, especially at the moment. But one of the big problems I think that regulators have is that there's no regulation of language. And if the word currency wasn't used, then it wouldn't be as misleading, and people wouldn't be thinking that they are buying money, or that Bitcoin would ever be a useful payment system.
So I want to end on a positive, because I have this terrible habit with no matter who I speak to, I always drag the conversation through all the doom and the gloom and the hypothetical. But with everything you know and with everything you've seen in the payment space so far, as we look to say, I don't know, the next 10 years, what gives you most hope about what's about to happen and how it's going to change our societies and our lives?
Oh, gosh, well, I never answer questions about the future. But I think what gives you the most hope is that there's much more attention and interest in payments today, and not just from the industry, I think from outside the industry. And that gives me hope, because it's always a problem when you have only experts and financially interested parties looking at things that have impacts far beyond their profit and loss statement. And payments is one such example. I mean, all of society needs payments, and it touches on so many questions. Whether it's control, privacy, access, inclusion, all sorts of stability, credit, debit, just so many different aspects of a wider society. I think it's very important that more people, whether it's the House of Lords or the House of Commons, or think tanks, newspapers, books, publishers even. I think it's fantastic that people are starting, and people like you are starting to think and look at payments. And when we tried to find a publisher for our book, we approached lots of agents, and I was personally really surprised that we actually succeeded in finding a publisher that was interested in payments, or interested to publish a book on payments, and sort of was prepared to go with us on the journey. And yes, it would have been possible to find, and it was. We did have several offers from, professional technical publishers, but that's not the book that we wanted to write. It was a much more of a general book, because this is such an interesting and important area. So that was incredibly gratifying, and it's been gratifying to see the amount of interest that it's got. One of the things that's been surprising to me is that the rights have been sold a lot into the Far East. So Japan, the 2 Chinese language translations, Korea, Taiwan. Lots of translation and book deals over there, but not so much in the European countries, which we're still working on. But there where payments have moved very, very fast, and there's very interlinked economies with problematics on the exchanges. Without the kind of benefits of the Eurozone, there's been an awful lot more there is an awful lot more awareness, I suppose, of what's going on and interest in it. So I think what makes me most optimistic is that people are paying attention.
Amazing. Natasha De Teran, thanks very much for this. I'm going to make sure that your book, The Payoff, How Changing the Way We Pay Changes Everything, is in the show notes so people can go and buy it and learn more about payments. If they want to go elsewhere to see your work in the meantime, can they head anywhere else?
Well, if they go to the website, thepayofthebook.com, they can see what we're up to, where we're speaking, other podcasts, where we're being written about or we're writing.
Amazing. Thanks very much.